As of the making of this video, Disney has released 3 versions of the classic Robert Louis Stevenson novel Treasure Island. Specifically the 1950 film Treasure Island, 1996's The Muppet Treasure Island, and the notorious 2002 flop Treasure Planet. Though to be fair, Disney was only a distributor on the Muppet Treasure Island and had very little involvement in its production, in contrast to the other two, which were made directly by the studio. And today, I'd like to take a look at both Treasure Island and Treasure Planet, the two adaptations that were made under Disney's personal management, and specifically compare and contrast what about them is the same and different between each other and the original novel. And as always, there are going to be major spoilers ahead for both movie adaptations and the original book. So in case you don't want any of those ruined, you might want to come back to this video another day. You have been warned. Okay. So to get the obvious out of the way first, obviously Treasure Island is a much more literal adaptation of the original book than Treasure Planet, being set in space and all of that. But even beyond that, it does have many differences from both the previous movie and book, particularly when it comes to the characters of Jim Hawkins and Long John Silver. Because Jim is only about 8 years old in the book and eager to go on an adventure, even if he does grow disillusioned by the end, while in Treasure Planet, he's a teenager with a lot of issues to work out. And what's particularly interesting here is that the entire core theme of the movie, which is the relationship between Jim and Silver, is completely different than most adaptations of the story, the 1950 film included. Because in Treasure Planet, Jim's biggest problem is that his father abandoned him and can't cope with it until Silver comes along and becomes the father figure he desperately needs. But in the novel, Jim's father is by all accounts a loving and caring family man who dies not long before the main events of the book take place. But by making this crucial change, as well as making Jim about 10 years older, they completely change what the story ends up being about. Not that this is a bad thing, mind you, as it ends up doing a really good job of telling this slightly altered version of the story. But to go along with this, in addition to turning Jim into a wayward teenager in desperate need of guidance and understanding, the movie also goes out of its way to make Silver a lot more sympathetic than he is in the book. Like, for example, in the novel, Silver is responsible for killing Mr. Arrow by giving him alcohol to drink during a storm, knowing he'll get drunk and fall overboard. Though, granted, since he only claims he did it and no proof is ever given one way or the other, it is possible he could be lying. But most assume he wasn't, with the 1950 version even outright showing those events playing out. But in Treasure Planet, Silver has nothing to do with Mr. Arrow's death and even furiously tells Scroop off for it after the fact. And also, in the book, Silver deliberately shoots Smollett in the back to try and gain the advantage, which is similarly depicted in the 1950 film, while in Treasure Planet, Captain Amelia is injured by Silver trying to save them from getting killed. Sure, he claims it's not to destroy the map, but that's still a much better reflection of his character, especially because he just couldn't bring himself to shoot Jim when he had the chance in the previous scene, which is also something that doesn't happen in the book and only at the very end of the 1950 version. And all of these changes to Silver's character mainly come down to the fact that the writers wanted him to truly become the father Jim didn't have. And in order to do that, they go out of their way to make sure he'll have the audience's sympathy. And as I spoke about at length in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, they did such a good job that Silver is pretty much the only sympathetic villain in Disney history to actually work and have his redemption feel earned. But as I also got into in that video, what's equally impressive is how well done and believable his dynamic with Jim really is. Because most would think Silver would be the last person Jim could ever learn something from, and yet he's the one who finally sets him on the right path. And a big reason for that is because Silver actually gives Jim the recognition he so desperately needs. Because as his mother notes, he is incredibly smart and talented, he just doesn't have the motivation to do anything about it. But when stuck doing chores for Silver, he does everything that's asked of him, even if he's not happy about it. Every task he's given, he not only finishes, but goes above and beyond in completing. And instead of just dismissing him as having done his job, Silver actually recognizes his accomplishments and rewards him accordingly, which is what finally starts giving Jim the motivation to actually try. In other words, we see in his youth that Jim never got the praise from his father that he needed, even when he accomplished the most simple task. So in the present, when he's expected to accomplish something, and thus doesn't get praise even when he does do it, he sees no point in even trying because he won't be given recognition one way or the other. But because Silver does recognize and praise him for both what he's done and will do, even when it's required of him anyway, it finally gives him the motivation he needs to actually try and better himself. Again, it may not be in the book, but what the writers managed to do with these characters is really impressive. But that being said, what makes the 1950 film just as notable in this department is that it also makes Silver out to be more sympathetic, even if it doesn't downplay his crueler deeds from the book nearly as much. Though, granted, the dynamic between him and Jim isn't nearly as complex or intimate as it is in Treasure Planet either, with it basically amounting to Jim and Silver getting the chance to voice their respect for each other before Silver escapes. Because despite it being common in most adaptations, such a scene between the two never occurs in the novel. After the treasure is recovered, Silver is put in the brig and manages to escape a few weeks later without him ever exchanging words with Jim again. But just like the Disney version in 1950, most change the ending so that Jim not only plays a part in his escape, whether purposely or unwittingly, but also gets to thank him for being a mentor to him and saving his life before he leaves. And where Silver is perhaps most sympathetic in the 1950 film is in the fact that he risks his life to save Jim at the climax. And while that does also happen in the book, in the movie, more emphasis is placed on the fact that he took a personal risk to save the boy, even if he still had the ulterior motive of helping Jim out to hopefully get back into Smollett's good graces. And honestly, that perhaps best sums up Silver's relationship with Jim in this version of Treasure Island. He's extremely nice and friendly to him, but usually for a reason. Though he does still seem to hold some genuine affection for him nonetheless. while on Jim's end, he first views Silver as an extremely cool mentor and his best friend, but after discovering the truth, only views him with contempt and sees him as a lonesome pirate, with that only giving way to reluctant respect after he saves his life. Basically, in the novel, Silver is sympathetic mainly because his crew is much more savage than he is, while in the Disney version he's more presented as a man you can't help but like in spite of yourself. And in Treasure Planet, he's made into a full-blown anti-villain with his vices heavily downplayed. But all these depictions of him serve the given changes to the story perfectly. Because again, in the 1950 movie, it's clear that Silver is a bad guy, but a likable one mainly due to his friendly facade and the fact that he goes to bat for Jim when it counts. So as a result, even the characters can't help but hope he gets away with the treasure he stole despite themselves. Now, obviously there are other differences I could go over, but honestly, Jim and Silver's characters, as well as the dynamic between them, are honestly the biggest differences between the two versions. The only other thing that really separates them are all the science fiction elements added to Treasure Planet, such as the plot twist of how Captain Flint was able to steal so much and having the planet rigged to blow up. But the thing is, the whole point of Treasure Planet is to basically be Treasure Island in space, so any differences pertaining to science fiction are kind of a given. Really, perhaps the most notable change other than that is Silver actually having both legs, as he's famously missing one in the book, as well as his little companion playing a much bigger role in the plot. And the score as well. Because while the 1950 version has a more typical yet appropriate adventure theme, Treasure Planet may just have one of the greatest, most beautiful scores ever written for an animated film, and it doesn't get nearly as much recognition as it deserves. And not to mention, Treasure Island is actually pretty violent, both by Disney and 1950s movie standards. But that aside, the only other thing to really look at is how much both movies impacted pop culture. And in this case, it's no contest that the 1950 version of Treasure Island wins out. Because not only was this the first totally live-action film Disney ever made, but it's considered one of the most accurate adaptations of the book out there. It perfectly captures exactly what Robert Louis Stevenson was going for, being a great example of a thrilling pirate adventure. And this is especially true for Robert Newton's performance as Long John Silver. Because few may know it today, but pretty much every single stereotype associated with pirates, particularly when it comes to the voice, all come from Newton's portrayal of Silver in this film. The accent, the use of the phrase "arr," and countless other things. In fact, Newton was so beloved in the role that he spent pretty much the rest of his career either playing Long John Silver or pirates very similar to him, cementing his status as the definitive pirate in perhaps all of cinema. Again, if there's a stereotype about pirates that wasn't around before 1950, Newton most likely invented it with this film. And it's unfortunate to say, but Treasure Planet never achieved anything even remotely resembling that. Sure, it does have a cult following nowadays, and some have reevaluated if it really deserved to bomb as hard as it did, but no matter how one looks at it, it just never had the pop culture prominence that the 1950 version did, and probably never will either. But that's not to say that it isn't still a good movie despite that, because as I already said, For a movie that lost almost $80 million, the writing behind pretty much everything is really impressive. It just never found its audience to give it proper recognition, which the 1950 film had a much easier time doing. So in the end, the point is that both movies did a great job of being what they were trying to be, and make for worthy adaptations of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novel. Because even if both do make changes, they manage to keep the essence of the story, which is about a young boy going on the adventure of a lifetime, all the while battling and befriending pirates, intact. And again, even the changes they do make still serve their version of the story well, proving that if there's one thing Disney understands, it's the story of Treasure Island. And because of that, both the 1950 version of Treasure Island and Treasure Planet can be considered among the best adaptations the book ever had, even with the deviations made to the source material, despite it not always being recognized as such. Alright, I think that pretty much ends this video. So now why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that both of Disney's versions of Treasure Island are good movies and adaptations of the original book? Or do you think one is clearly much better than the other? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you are under no obligation to agree with this video just because you watched it. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel any way you want to about both Treasure Island and its many movie adaptations. And if you think I had it all wrong, that's completely fine. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.